Wow, it's a lot of words, Brad. That's pretty impressive. So we got this text here from Hebrews, and it's interesting about the book of Hebrews, the epistle to Hebrews. It's seen as written by Paul, but most scholars think it was actually written much later than that probably written after Paul had died, but it was written in the context of Paul's understanding of the struggles of the church, of the early community of followers of Jesus. And you have these churches all over the place now because after the temple destroyed in 70 A.D. and Jews, the two remaining sects of Jews, which were basically the Orthodox Jews and the followers of Jesus Jews. And so, and then of course you had the Gentiles that were coming into the church. So you had this really interesting, well, some would say complicated and difficult mix of people making up the church, which interestingly 2,000 years later isn't a whole lot different from what we find today, right? We still have this interesting and sometimes conflicting mix of people who make up the church. And it's just a part of reality. But Paul understood that, and then this pseudonymous writer who uses Paul's name has the same understanding. The scholars think that actually this was probably a missive that sort of circulated, kind of letter that went to a lot of different churches. So it was a common sort of theme of this struggle. Where do we focus on it? How do we get back to focusing on what's important? How do we, with the diversity and the challenges of people coming from backgrounds, you had the conservative Jews who were saying, if you're going to be a part of Jesus' followers, they're still Jews. They're just following Jesus, this Jew. And if you're going to be a part of that, you've got to be a Jew. You've got to be converted to Judaism. The conservatives were saying, you have to do this, you have to look like this, to be like this, to practice like this, then you can follow Jesus. But the other followers of Jesus who were saying, like, it's open, people. The doors are wide open. Everybody's welcome to come in and be a part of this community of compassion. This is how the world changes. They were also aware of the fact, as you got the end of that text, that this imminent day of Jesus' return wasn't so imminent. We're now in the second century, in the early part of the second century. So now we're trying to understand, what does it mean to be a part of God's kingdom? Is God's kingdom already happening? And what does that look like if it's already happening? So we call it in here, we call it God's kingdom, because it's how we connect with one another, connect with God in the midst of all of our lives, that we are already transforming the world in the here and now. So the question for the early church then, how do we get to the love? Where is the love with all of this conflict and all of this diversity and this challenge of being with one another? So he says, in all of this, he says, provoke one another to acts of love and good deeds. Provoke. Now, I'm going to play with this word because I like to play with words. Consider how to provoke one another to good deeds, to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together. That's just a plug. Y'all show up every Sunday. Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, because some were getting rather distressed and frustrated with the tension. I mean, what keeps people together, right? You talk about what keeps people together. You talk about what inspires you. You talk about what gives you hope. And that's hopefully what the kingdom is about. So don't neglect the getting together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Now, the author uses the word encouraging, and he uses the word provoke. Now, I want to play with this idea that provoke does not necessarily mean encourage. But when we typically think of provoke, we typically think of this idea of irritating. And as you know, if you've looked at my business card, I don't have a problem with irritating people. But I want to do it in a creative way, right? So, but my wife reminds me sometimes I need to lay back a little bit on the irritation factor. It doesn't win votes, for example, necessarily. But if you look at the business card, it says Tom McDermott, Reverend such and such associate. Then it says creative irritant. I didn't give myself that name, by the way. It was Melinda Smoot, our communications director, who decided to put creative irritant underneath there because I used to be on the communications team. So, and my writers group. My writers group used to love it because they would come in with their manuscripts and they would read the manuscripts and I would just go, it doesn't work. And they'd say, is that helpful? And I'd say, I don't know, but it doesn't work. So they'd have to go back and they'd have to rebuild and rethink. And eventually they'd realize it didn't work, but I couldn't always put my finger on it. So I want to talk with you about what this idea of provoke means. Proverbs 27:17 has this great line that says, it's as if iron is sharpening iron, so a person sharpens a friend. As iron sharpens iron, so a person sharpens a friend. What is that idea? I mean, think about that idea of provoking or provocation as iron sharpening iron. It's pretty rough at first, right? It's a pretty hard process early on. And yet it becomes somewhat smooth. Eventually you find the fine detail of sharpening knives and sharpening iron, but early on, this idea of provocation. So let's play with the word. To provoke actually means not angering. I mean, you can have that notion. There is that angering, risky, threatening idea. But the older etymology of the word actually means to bring out or to entice, to call out or to stir or challenge forward. This idea of pro and voke, this idea of finding a way forward, but not just simply you being the way forward, but luring others a way forward. And I want to challenge you that it is less about you trying to convince somebody else to be something and more about you changing yourself in order to open the way for others. I wanted you to think about that as a provocation. Not so much that it's about how can I provoke you, but what do I need to do to change myself? Because if we know anything, we already know in this culture that we live in that if somebody comes up with an opinion that we're diametrically opposed to, going right at them with the opposite of that opinion is not effective. And most of us don't ever come out of those situations with a sense of, that was satisfying, that worked, they changed their mind, and now they're going to be just like I want them to be. That never works. And yet, why do we keep doing it? Right? Why do we keep going there? And I've told you, I mean, we've talked about it in here before. I think neurologically we're captive to the chemistry of our brains, but we're not captive consciously, right? We are captive in our unconscious, but we can consciously change some of that chemistry by being intentional, by finding new ways. So the provocations oftentimes have to happen with us if we're going to be able to bring about this sense of openness and this sense of love that allows for grace, that allows for God's presence to heal, to redeem, to change things. We have to change ourselves. Sometimes that means that instead of trying to provoke or to irritate with a new idea, it means not saying anything. It means, yes, it is hard, isn't it? It is hard. And sometimes you got to speak out against injustice. And sometimes you got to speak out against oppression. But I guarantee you're just preaching to the choir 90% of the time. That's the challenge of provoking love, of bringing about opportunities for love, is because 90% of the time when we speak out, we're just preaching to the choir. And while sometimes it gives us some sense of satisfaction to kind of go at it hard with somebody, it also sometimes just produces the opposite consequence. And not just for the other person, for ourselves. How many of you have ever been in an argument or been in a place where you found yourself in a debate and you represented this side with fervent energy, you were just arduously arguing your point and coming back at somebody angrily, and you feel for the moment you were vindicated, and how many of you feel wonderful after that? You know? It's like an addiction, people. It's just the same chemistry, right? It's the same adrenal glands that are activated. And so what do you do when you get on a drug and it gets you going? You come down off of that drug and you start feeling bad. Or you start feeling this withdrawal. You start feeling this sadness. Or you start reinforcing this negativity bias that's a part of who we are. The only way to truly change people with provocations of love is to be provocations of love, to change ourselves in a way where we are going the same places where Jesus went, right? We're just doing that stuff. And other people then finally get a chance not to react out of defense or anger or frustration or fear, but they get to operate out of a sense of curiosity. And I want to suggest to you that curiosity is perhaps one of the most profound tools we have for provoking acts of love. Last week I mentioned the two words curiosity and courage, because it takes courage to do this. It takes courage to change ourselves. It takes courage to hold back. It takes courage to be vulnerable in these kinds of moments. And what does the word courage mean? It means to have heart. To be at that place where we can open enough to feel here and not here, to feel at the level of our heart and our gut and not at the level of our head and our chemistry. So it takes courage, and it takes this curiosity on our part to entice that from others. I'm going to ask Lisa to come forward real quick. And we're going to do a little song. And it's sort of, it fits with this theme. And then I'm going to wrap up with a thought afterwards. But Lisa's with us today. And whenever Lisa's with us, I just like to have an opportunity to sing. This came to me last night as I was thinking about the impact that we get to have in the world. The difference that we can make in the world, and how subtle that difference can sometimes be, and yet how profound in the long run those small actions, those subtle actions that we do, how much of a profound effect they can have down the line. So let's see if I got some volume here. I don't know which one's the volume. Okay, here we go. Bear with us. We only worked through this one time this morning, and we said it'll be like we're in our living room, and we don't really know what we're doing.
It's pretty normal.
And I haven't played the guitar in a while, so here we go. We get to be a ripple in the water. We get to be a rock that's thrown. We get to be a boy on a bridge, standing over the reservoir. I see the water lap along the shoreline, a buried forest of a man-made lake. Cemeteries are laying underneath it, your heart like a dam when it breaks. We're floating and we're swimming, and in this moment we are forgetting what it costs, what it takes for one perfect love when we look the other way. I'm okay if I don't look a little closer, and I'm okay if I don't see beyond the shore. I'm okay if I don't do the killing or know what the killing is for. We're talking and we're driving, and in this moment we are denying what it costs, what it takes for one perfect world when we look the other way. One perfect world when we look the other way. It's one perfect world when we look the other way. It's one perfect world. You can see beyond the myth of isolation, and the miracle of daybreak doesn't move you anymore. Connect the points and then see the constellations as the night comes down on the reservoir. And we're turning and we're floating, and in this moment we are beholden to what it costs, to what it takes for one perfect world. Can we look the other way? Perfect way. Can we learn to live another way? It's a perfect world. Can we learn to live another way? Perfect world. We get to be a ripple on the water. So there's we do this prayer. We do this blessing at the end of the service every week now. We've been doing it. And it's this blessing written by this friend that I've met through another friend, Peter Rollins, a guy by the name of Patrick Otuma. And we'll do it at the end of this service. Patrick Otuma is part of a place called the Caramila community. And the Caramila community is in Northern Ireland. It was started back in the 80s, late 80s, around the issues of the Troubles, right around the conflicts between the Protestants and the Catholics, between the English and the Irish in Northern Ireland. And these conflicts had come on for so many years, so many deaths, so much struggle, so much strife, so much prejudice, so much inbred, unknowing hatred. In fact, he tells this wonderful story of the community where youth had come, and they'd had a youth gathering. These were probably 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, so younger youth, and they were basically kids from some of these higher-risk communities, but from both sides of the spectrum. And at one point, they'd had Patrick, who's a priest. He was a priest, a Jesuit priest, and they asked him in one conversation, they said, Patrick, or they said Padre, because they called him Father. They said, Padre, I have a question. And he said, okay, fine. And the girl said, God made us all, right? And so she sets up the proposition already, that she's sort of getting the whole thing all set up. And she said, God made us, right? And he says, well, yeah, that's right. God made us. And he said, God made the Catholics. Is that correct? And he said, I guess that's true. God made Catholics. And she said, and God made the Protestants? Yes, that's right. And God loves everybody. And he said, I suppose that's true. And she said, well, then why do we hate the Protestants? And he said, I don't understand. What do you mean by that? And she said, well, all I know is that we hate the Protestants, so how can you say God loves the Protestants if we hate the Protestants? Something's not right there. And he could see already that this wide conflict of thinking was already beginning to take place. It was rooted in her. She hadn't even been born by the time that the peace accord was agreed upon, which was in 1997. She hadn't even been born at that point. It happened in 2012. And so he said something completely surprising, and it's completely provoking, if you will. He said, I don't remember her name, but he said, Ellen, and she said, yeah. And she said, you play football, soccer, right? She says, you play football, and she said, yeah. And she said, you really love football? And she said, yeah. He said, did you know the Protestant team is looking for an amazing forward on their football team? And she smiled and she said, really? And before you know it, she was no longer thinking about the conflict. She was thinking about what she loves. And it went to a different direction entirely. So much of our thinking has nothing to do with reality, right? It has only to do with things that we've inherited or things that we've ingrained in our own thinking or entrained in our own neurology. And to move us beyond that, we have to begin to provoke. We have to find opportunities to create space for where that can happen. One of the stories when he says that they've gathered some people together for a week retreat, and one man who was a Protestant had gathered there, and he had a disdain for the Catholics, but there they were, both of them, Protestant, Catholic, all adults, 20 people, and he had this terrible disdain because his uncle had died earlier in like the 1940s in a conflict, and so he came with a lot of bitterness, and this was not going to work, and you could see why he would think that, why he would have this bitterness, and how deep this thing was for him. But nobody talked about that. Nobody talked about conflicts. Nobody talked about war and violence. Nobody talked about history of hatred. They did things like serving in the community. They did things like planting gardens. They did things like doing other projects together. And somewhere about 8-9 days into the thing, this guy James, he's meeting in a small group of about 10 people. And he says, I have something to ask you. And so they all listen, and he said, I want you to be honest. Are there times when what I say, the words I speak, hurt you? And of course, he was talking to some of the Catholics in the room. He says, I just want to know. They all looked at him and they said, oh, James, no, James, you're a good man. We all love you. You're a good man. And he said, don't patronize me. He said, I mean it. Are there times when I have said things that you have found hard to hear and painful? Well, and then they started looking at each other, kind of smiling, and then one of them said, well, let's see, there's that time, and then there was this time, and then there was this time. And then and then another one said, don't forget there was that time. And then by the time they started counting them up, they said, I don't know, after the first hour, there was a lot of them to count. And he said, you're kidding me. The things I have said, and they shared with him the reality that oftentimes we don't know the words that we carry, what kind of power they carry, what kind of potential hatred or what kind of bias they carry. Language is weaponized all the time without our intention because we live in tribal settings. We live in communities of same thinking. Before we can begin to challenge that, we have to create space in our own minds, in our own spaces, our own presence that allows someone else to come into that place without defensiveness, without that chemistry, without that history. And only then when we can do that, we begin to provoke this possibility of change. The word karamelia is a funny word, and I love this. Rumi says it this way. Well, here, first of all, the word karamelia, when they established Carmela, the word supposedly meant harmony. And they thought that was perfect because we're talking about the North and the South, the Catholic and the Protestant, and harmony. How many of you experienced perfect harmony in any and all of your relationships? They thought it was really sweet, but 10 years later, they get a visit from an etymologist, a linguistics etymologist, and he says, do you know what the real words of karamelia actually mean? And they said, well, no. And he said, it means place where bumpy hills meet. And they said, well, that explains everything. Because that's the reality of it, right? The reality of life isn't harmony, it's more dissonance. But we have to welcome the dissonance and look forward to the consonant moments. Redemption is probably one of the most profound experiences we can ever experience. If you go around and you ask people, what really gives you the deepest joys? Well, you might say, well, it's when I went here and I climbed the mountain, or when I got to do this thing, or when I got to hold my baby child, grandchild. I mean, yeah, we have these wonderful moments, but ask anybody who has reconciled with an estranged parent. Ask anybody who is reconciled with an angry neighbor. Ask anybody who has found a connection they didn't expect to find with somebody on the other side of the political spectrum, and you will see someone who says, I experienced a miracle. I experienced this profound sense of connection where I never thought there was before. This unexpected wonder. That requires provocation, people. We get to do that. We get to be a ripple in the water. We get to do that. But it requires us being willing to be open spaces for grace to happen. And sometimes that means we have to challenge our own thinking just enough to allow other thoughts to come in, to find other connections, other ways of being together. Last thing I want to share with you. Y'all know this story, right? How many of you all know your Buddhist stories in here, right? Yeah. No? Okay, so, yeah, Lynn's got his hand up. I got a funny story about Lynn. So Lynn, talking about provocation, Tim, do you mind if I tell your story? So Tim, one day, is following a car in the right lane on the highway, my son Tim, and he's driving along behind him, and there's somebody in the van in front of him that's moving really, really slow, and so at some point, Tim's just trying to kind of get around the van and is kind of taking up a little bit of the lane there, and finally he goes around the van, and my son Tim's just kind of lost his patience, and he doesn't ever do this anymore. He never loses his... No, don't go there. This was Matt that did that? It wasn't Tim? Oh. All right, I'm so glad you're here, yeah. I get my boys confused all the time. So, it was Matt that did that, really? You don't know how many times I've said it was you. So Matt pulls, that explains everything. So Matt pulls around beside him and then kind of, all right, he flips him off and then speeds on ahead, but as he flips him off, he looks back and he says, oh my gosh, and he realizes who it was, and then he immediately pulls over, when he gets to the parking lot, he pulls in and he texts Mom, and he says to his mom, he says, Mom, I feel terrible, I just flipped off Jesus. Well, because we have this wonderful image. Oh. All right. My sons provide me with ample material, right? Yes, right. The same kind of thing, yeah. This is an interesting sort of reality that we find ourselves in these impatient moments all the time and never realize where our actions go, where our ripples continue to move beyond us. And yet we have these opportunities to create space on the highway, at the business place, the workplace. Somebody's not working cooperatively with us. That's an opportunity to create a space of grace even there. And so we have all of these wonderful chances to do that. So this wonderful little Buddhist story goes like this. The student went to his master. I found it in the book of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Some of y'all know this. Robert Pirsig was telling his son about something, and his son asks him a question, and Robert tells his son, he says, so this master was looking at his student, and his student said, Master, does a dog have Buddha nature or not? To which the master replies the famous response of, moo. Now, we take that to mean something completely ridiculous, like the sound of a cow, but the actual meaning, Japanese meaning of the word moo, means neither or. Ask a better question. That's what it means. Sometimes I think when we find ourselves in prayer, when we find ourselves in a situation with someone else, when we find ourselves in these conflicts we see about in news and we've already made up our mind, I think, moo, it's neither or. We've got to ask a better question. And when we do that, we begin to provoke a place where all of us can find this kingdom together. Amen.